It's just okay. Here we go. So the topic is web sustainability or sustainable web. What does that mean exactly, and what is the right terminology? Mike, do you want to take that first, and then Stuart can chip in?
For sure. I mean, I just generally think of this as digital sustainability. The internet, information communication technology, our digital suite of tools, most of which are connected to the internet, most of which are web driven or have web components to them, are really people don't think about the environmental impact of them, but they consume a great deal of water, a great deal of electricity, both in terms of the cooling and the powering of the computers. There's also probably the biggest energy use and the biggest sort of environmental impact for computing is the devices themselves. We've built these devices and companies have convinced us that we need to get a new phone or a new computer every 2 or 3 years, and the environmental cost of producing and disposing these devices is enormous. So it's just trying to go off and to make visible the invisible, because the environmental costs are there. The rate of change around digital, there's so much more adoption of digital technologies in the last 10 years, and it's accelerating exponentially. So especially if you're looking at AI or virtual reality, like our requirements for compute are enormous. Or photos, like there's more photos in existence now than there were, for most of like in the last 2 or 3 years, there's probably more photos being taken than there have been for all of humanity's existence. So just sort of that idea of how much information we're collecting and organizing or not organizing, and it takes energy to go off and maintain and organize all of this stuff. So raising awareness of it and trying to take something that is invisible and say it's actually the impact is as big or bigger than the airline industry. It's something that we don't think about it as that much of an impact, but it does really have a huge environmental impact on our planet, and it's something that we need to start thinking more clearly about.
Thanks, Mike. And I noticed in the Sustainable Web Manifesto, it
Oh,
said
great.
the internet was a country, it would be the fourth largest polluter.
Yes.
It's just, to frame it in those contexts. Yeah. Stuart, is there anything you want to add?
That was a really good summary. I just break down some ideas about the impact of different parts of the process. So data centers where you're hosting things are about 15% of the CO2 emissions. The network, so sending stuff across the network is about the same, 14-15%. The browser, like Mike said, the browser or your device rather is 52% of the energy cost at the
Well,
end user, and about 19%.
Thanks.
Sorry. Oh, I thought someone was
Unmuted. I've just muted.
Okay.
Go for
And
it.
then the hardware, because the sunk costs in hardware in replacing servers every few years and things, that's about 20% or so of the energy cost. So this is all, like Mike said, hidden, invisible use, because you just see a web page and it all just happens. You don't see all the energy use in the background.
That's really interesting. So you said 15% on hosting, and that's one area that gets a lot of talk about, but actually 50 odd percent on your browser or your device.
That's so Website Carbon, which I'll be mentioning at some point later, they've looked at all sorts of analysis, like papers and things, and meta-analyses of papers, because people give you different ideas of carbon emissions from everything, because it's very hard to come up with just one figures for things, and different people with different methodologies looking at either specific bits of a system or the whole system come up with very different numbers. But in their meta-analysis of stuff, they've tried to work out how things break down, and that's how they've split it. So about half of it is the end device, and like I said, 15% from data centers, another 15% from network, and the rest from hardware.
And it does really make sense, because data centers are centralized. You're buying the same product over and over again. They're driven by businesses who need to be very careful about where they're making their money. And if they can save money on electricity, then that's a significant cost that they can cut in and increasing their profits. Whereby most consumers don't really care whether or not something uses, a 210 volts or 220 volts, like it's, or sorry, not watts, not volts. But the analysis for consumers is far more relaxed, and people care much more about the quality of the screen or the what other features are bundled in the product. Sustainability is really an afterthought for most average consumers.
Yeah.
In terms of websites, part of what, if your website has a lot of JavaScript on it that does a lot of processing, that uses more power on the end user's device. So some of it is about data transfer, and then just sometimes uncompressing that in the browser, because often it's sent compressed. So the browser and the phone or whatever someone's using has to uncompress it all, and that takes a bit of energy. And then if there's a lot of processing on the page, that uses more energy as well. So there are ways that people can save by just reducing the amount of computing that's happening at different points along the path from generating a website to someone viewing it and using a website.
And I think it's really useful to go off and to make that distinction between the amount of like JavaScript uses a lot of energy, because you have to customize and provide there's a lot of compute power that's required in order to execute a JavaScript file or a JSON file. To do stuff in the browser is a very energy intensive thing to undertake. It affects people's local battery lives. If they're running on a mobile system, it is something that can have larger impacts in terms of the life of the machine if you're constantly draining the battery and then bring it back up. Like there are consequences to that, but people often, if they're looking at sustainability, are looking at how do we what is the page weight, and looking at the overall page weight without actually breaking it down into, well, 1 megabyte of images is going to have a much smaller compute than 1 megabyte of JavaScript. So again, trying to focus our attention in on what can have the biggest impact for our users.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, sort of related to this, I mean, Stuart, you wanted to draw a point about, like, I've got a really stupid question, which is like, why should we care? And I think and it does sound like a stupid question, but I think you wanted to make a point, which is not. There's obviously,
yes, aside from the climate crisis, which is obviously a fundamentally
I'm going to take that as a given.
Problem. We'll take that as a given. I also think it's very important for the most deprived citizens. So Ofcom in 2021 did analysis where they reckon that something around the order in the UK of 2 million households are experiencing affordability issues with either fixed broadband or mobile internet. So that's a lot of people who are struggling with internet. A lot of them of those people, and I don't have a figure for it, but a lot of them will be on limited data plans, and they might not be able to afford more than, well, a few years ago they said a gigabyte. They might have 3 or 5 gigabytes now. That will be across a month. If your homepage is 30 megabytes, say, and they had a 1 gigabyte data plan, visiting your homepage would use basically a day's worth of data just to visit your homepage, not to do anything else, not to check the bin times or anything. They potentially have used up a day's worth of data in doing that. And they might be on a very non-performant device. They could be on a PlayStation 5 because that's their only internet device that they've got. So basically, if you reduce the size of your web pages, you also help the citizens who are the most deprived, which I think is important for councils particularly.
And even if you're dealing with a business that only cares about making money, we know that if you have a more performant website that loads faster, that you will have greater trust from your customers and greater client retention. So they're going to come back, they're going to trust you, they're going to go off and buy your products more because they feel that like, nobody likes to wait for a web page to load. And even if you're a rich person out in their country home with a limited Wi-Fi package because they're out walking the hills, like, this is stuff that is not just poor people. It's not just like everyone has to deal with this. And so absolutely we should be trying to go off and support those who are the least in our society. But it's not just them either that are dealing with will benefit from these improvements.
like with accessibility, it's not
Yeah.
everyone is disabled or has lacking abilities in various contexts depending on where they are. And
That's right.
if you want a poor 3G signal in the middle of the countryside, you
Yeah.
also have a problem with limited data.
I can totally go along with that, given where I am. Yeah. So I think we've sort of covered this a little bit, but how do you measure carbon emissions? So if we look at, we're gonna look at like accounts. I think you've got an example, and you're going to talk through your process, Stuart, a little bit. But how do you measure emissions? Because I don't think it is. There's not a totally agreed standard. And Mike, you might have I think you've got a view on like the different approaches that you can take, or the challenge of measuring this stuff.
So I could talk about it a bit more before we jump into the council example that Stuart's created. There are a bunch of different models for how to go off and evaluate this. A lot of it depends on estimates and guesswork around how compute is going to be running. You're not going to get a CO2 solution or an answer that follows for your exact device with the transmissions that are happening immediately on your web page. But there are a number of open source tools that are being developed for cloud clusters to try and understand how different cloud computing environments compare. There's efforts like the website carbon.com and EcoGrader that are proprietary, but are focusing on what can they do to build a tool that's sort of like WebAIM's Wave toolbar that gives people feedback and direction about how they can improve their work. There's also a broader standard that's being implemented by the World Wide Web Consortium. There's a community group that's moving into a working group and has already got a nice draft that we are putting forward on this, which tries to learn from the web content accessibility guidelines to say, well, what if we're going to build a web sustainability guidelines, what are the things we should be looking for? How do we try and make sure that we're thinking about this holistically, so that we're thinking about not just assigning a page weight, not just looking at whether or not the content is being served from a server that is known to use renewable energy, but that we're looking at, well, is this page actually producing content that is like, there's no point having an environmentally friendly website for a product that is environmentally destructive. What is the overall impact of this particular site, and how do we try and deal with it? How do we make sure that the site is accessible so that people can access the information as quickly as possible, as opposed to trying to hunt around and figure out, clicking on a lot of different web pages to get what they're trying to find. So that's some of the guidelines that are some of the approaches and principles that we're trying to build within the web sustainability guidelines. And we're also trying to learn from things like this Web Sustainability Manifesto, which was created a few years ago by Tom Greenwood and a number of other people who were interested in trying to build a set of ideals that can be used to help inform web agencies on how they should be approaching this work.
I'll just add, it's
Yeah,
impossible to be perfect and to get exact numbers for any of this, because like Mike said, it really depends exactly on every individual person's situation, how far exactly you are away from the website you're trying to connect to and things like that, your particular device. So it's impossible to be completely correct. I think the website Carbon, there's some blog posts, and the source code's open, at least version 2 was, so you can get the code that they use to do the analysis. They make the methodology is clearly, it's very well written actually, with the very simple equations they use to work out a figure. And they make the point that it's best to have a figure. It may not be the exactly correct figure, but it is the right sort of ballpark to let you do something about it right now, rather than wait 20 years for people to decide the full analysis that would give you the inverted commas correct figure, by which point it's far too late to do anything. So it's really about just finding, for me, it's about finding the lowest branches, the lowest hanging fruit, and doing the biggest improvements you can do, because actually for a lot of council websites, there are some very big wins that are very easy to do and would literally take minutes.
And so much of it is like, how can you make sure that what your site is better today than it was yesterday, right? It's progress over perfection, and building that mindset in there so that we're constantly on the journey, just like you are with security, to make sure your site is of a better quality, because it is not a there's no checklist that you can go through that you can say you're done and this is all you need to do to sort of have a perfect website. It's just a journey.
So yeah, I totally agree. So it's about, keep iterating, keep improving. So Stuart, do you want to talk us through an example? So you think you've got
Yep. So
example council?
hopefully you can see that browser. So that's Website Carbon, very useful for checking pages that are on the open internet and telling you your emissions. I use their code and I created this page, which is a list of all UK councils. As I said, I update it monthly. I use Website Carbon's new rating system, which is a bit like energy performance certificates. You get a nice color-coded grading. I do a breakdown of how many councils are in each band, 89 in the worst band, but there are 9 in an A+, which is good. And then I've got some things you could do in a big list. And then for each council, I do an individual breakdown. So you've got the history of all the measurements that I've done. You can view that by page size if you want instead. And then I do a table so you can see how that's changed over time. So the London Borough of Hackney is currently the worst council in the country in terms of CO2 emissions, and its homepage, according to so the code behind the scenes is actually using Google's page speed insights in order to do the analysis of the page, and then it converts that into CO2 estimates using Website Carbon's methodology. But that's about 30 megabytes nearly for that homepage. So below this table, I give some very specific information for that council on what they can specifically do. So here are a bunch of images which it says these are quite big images that you could probably do a better job of optimizing. Other large files, in this example, this 14 megabyte file is an MP4 file, so it's a video, and it actually, from the URL, you can see it's, well, maybe you can't see the URL, but it's a Facebook video on Hackney's website. If I go to Hackney's website, the website itself is fine. That there are 2 things at the bottom of this homepage that are causing the majority of the emissions on this page. So if you go down to the bottom, you've got a Facebook timeline and a Twitter or X timeline here. The Facebook one has a video that starts playing, and that's using 14.3 megabytes worth of data. They also have over 9 megabytes due to Twitter, or X as it is now, and that's because X, their little widget here, loads hundreds and hundreds of images from the last however long on their timeline. So all of that is loaded regardless of whether anyone even gets to the bottom of the page or scrolls down that timeline. There are over 200 images being loaded. So that's very slow because you've got to make 200 separate requests from your browser and get each one. I'm not quite sure why both Facebook and Twitter are not optimized as well as I would have hoped, because they're quite big concerns and would want to save money, I would hope. But anyway, there's over 20 odd megabytes just due to the Facebook video that happens to be somewhere on this timeline, and due to all these images on the Twitter timeline. So that's an example of some widgets that cause your website to be bad. Another example was Dartford. If I just go to the Dartford one, they've got a 10.7 megabyte image, which is a banner, and I can't actually get to it, but if I click on there, it's this picture, which is, when you go to their homepage, is the 3rd item in a carousel. So a lot of people might not even see this image, and it's 10.7 megabytes. It's pretty big. It's 4,320 by 1,200 pixels. So it's probably more than it needs to be size-wise. It would be really easy to optimize this. If, for anyone who's non-technical, in Windows Photos or a Mac OS, there's an equivalent Photos app as well. You can open it up and just click resize and change the pixel size. that would reduce the file size of this quite a bit. If you change it's been saved as a PNG image, and a PNG is great for sort of vector or graphical content, but doesn't do so well on photography. JPEG would be a better format, or WebP, which is a more modern format, but JPEG would be a much better format and is easy to save from Windows Photos or the equivalent on Mac or the equivalent on Linux. So you could very quickly, in the space of under a minute, open this in Windows Photos, just click resize, just change the format, just resizing it down to 2,700 pixels across, which is still massive and more than enough for most people's needs, would reduce the file size from over 10 megabytes to a few hundred kilobytes. So you would save 9 to 10 megabytes just with a minute's worth of work. And that 9 or 10 megabytes is replicated across everyone who visits your homepage. All have to download this huge image that you can see almost every leaf on the background there. Quite often councils like to put pictures of mayors or chief executives with enough resolution that I'm sure the person themselves would be horrified that you could see every pore on their face. So sometimes just reducing the size of the image in pixels is good enough. Another thing you can do is use, as I say here, there's a website called tinyjpeg.com and tinypng.com, which are very useful. If I load in that Glimmer Twins banner, that massive image, oh, it's too big. I can't load that in. So I don't want to resize it first. But some of the other images, it does an optimization, so it tries to remove a lot of metadata that's often stored in images that no one ever sees unless you're the photographer, and there's all sorts of stuff about the camera and all sorts of extra information that's completely not needed by any of the people who visit your website. It's just taking up space for no good reason. So it removes a lot of that. It also does some compression optimization on the image to try and reduce the number of colors and things without making any real perceptible difference to the image. So it's a very useful tool that within a few seconds will give you a much smaller image generally. So that's a good one. Reading Borough Council do a mistake they make, in my mind, is they put a massive auto-playing background video at the top of the page. So there's 5 megabytes of data that doesn't really do an awful lot. It gives you a bit of flashy wishiness. Universities really like to do this, especially when it comes to September and clearing time. All the universities suddenly, because I do an analysis for universities as well in the UK, and their websites all start, their homepages rather, all start to become very, very big at September as they try to get people, because everyone makes the assumption that flashing, moving video is attractive. So, but I'm sure there are other ways that this could be done, that maybe just static images that fade between each other would perhaps be more optimal. But anyway, that's another thing that people do. But the big thing is images that I've found across all of the UK council websites. Images are the big easy win. They're by far the biggest impact. Videos are less used. So it's just this example and the Facebook one. And I think I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. That's amazing. And you might have said this at the beginning, but what you were testing and the ratings are based on the homepage only, right?
Yes, because it's quite a lot of work to do an entire website, because I'd have to basically be Google and crawl through every part of the website. But homepages I felt was a good place, because that's where a lot of people will land. The people who want to check their bin times will probably go to their local council homepage. Maybe they'll go direct to a bin page or something, as that is a major thing people want to do. But I think people quite often land on a council homepage in order to try and get somewhere else. So I felt that was the representative. And obviously it's going to have a lot more stuff on it than a normal page. It's going to have news items and flashy banners and carousels and things. So it will probably be one of the worst pages on your website, unless you've got online embedded maps. They tend to be quite big as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
ArcGIS uses an awful lot.
So what I'm
That's
going
a
to
side
do,
issue.
sorry, Stuart. What I'm going to do is just share the Miro board again and bring Mike in. We're going to start talking just like you've gone into this, Stuart, which is around like what you can do to improve or reduce the carbon footprint. Obviously, we're talking about homepage, but this is applicable to any page on your website. And like with Drupal, you've got different content types and templates, so you're almost fixing them, I presume, at that level, as depending on what you've got embedded on particular pages. Mike, for you, what's the sort of key things to consider when you're looking to improve or reduce the carbon footprint of your?
Well, one thing I look for is where can you turn off JavaScript? There's on many different government websites, there is tracking which was enabled for some reason that is being left on. Sometimes it's multiple different analytics programs that are enabled, and they're just not turning them off. So I think that making the choice to go off and to look at your JavaScript and to prioritize those tools, like Google Analytics is the most commonly used analytics tool, but most users actually don't spend the time to go off and to dig in the details behind what Google Analytics provides. Most government agencies don't need to know all that information. So for government councils, opting for a open source, privacy respecting, tool that is out there is probably one of the easiest things that they could do, is just switch from Google Analytics to something that is open source, more private, and far smaller in terms of its weight on the page. Another thing is making sure you're for Drupal turning on page compression. So and you've got your caching configured correctly, because that is a problem where people often they'll turn off caching because they're doing testing, and then they'll forget to turn it back on again. So making sure you're caching your pages properly to see that's being done properly. Using the advanced aggregation module is something that can be helpful. I'm not sure if that's if that or if there's another JavaScript aggregation tool which is built into the local gov distro, but that's certainly something that's worth looking at. I also like the fences module, because the fences module allows you to actually define what your HTML is. Often there in Drupal there is a bloat of divs that is part of it, and so if you can have reduce the amount of HTML that's being presented to the page, particularly for things that are repeated over and over again. Like there are some components of your page that are going to be reused over and over again. Like in a view, you may have the same template used hundreds of times on a page. So if you can optimize that, anytime you're repeating a pattern hundreds or thousands or millions of times, like that, like look for those opportunities where there's opportunities to reduce that bit of code that is maybe small but is used millions of times. Again, switching to WebP and AVIF, there's modules to support that as well. You can help your users go off and to convert the files that they upload to a more optimized format. That's definitely something that's worth looking at. There may be people, like there's so much overlap between performance and sustainability as well. There's a great tool called sitespeed.io that is sort of like it's sort of like Google Lighthouse, but it uses a different set of tools, but it will crawl most of your website. So it's an easy way to go off and crawl a huge number of pages that give you a better sort of statistical view of where some of the problems are on the page. And you can tie in co2.js into that, which is another good carbon analysis tool that's available. There's also a great tool called Unlighthouse that's like Google Lighthouse, but instead of evaluating one page, it again tries to crawl your entire web page or a set of sitemap tools or sorry, if you have a sitemap.xml file, it'll try and crawl that and evaluate that. But so much of this is just like look at your page, try and find out, like, can you set a page budget? What do you want your page weight to be, and can you try and look for pages that are outside of that? How do we try and find those outliers in your page that maybe there's a big fat 2 megabyte image that somebody got uploaded. Maybe there's something else that is slowing down the page because a view wasn't cached, and that's taking a lot of time for the page to load. Just take the time to look at this and build this into your definition of what a quality web page means to you in your organization.
I'll just add, Mike, on a specific example that I've seen quite a few times on UK council websites, are badly implemented chatbots. So usually it's to try and be helpful, and because I guess people decide that the site search doesn't work well enough and it's to help you find your way around. The ones that I say are badly implemented seem to basically create a JSON object, which is almost the entire content of the website, and serve that up in order to work. So when someone hits your homepage, they're getting all of this content that won't be useful for visiting other pages because it's a sort of data representation of all the other pages. But it ends up with adding megabytes of JavaScript and JSON to your homepage load, which most people are not going to use either. So sometimes just check any third-party or external widgets that you're adding just to see how they're performing in terms of page weight.
And that would be such an
Aaron,
easy
I think
thing to
you're on mute.
fix, right? If you could go and just set it up so you want to have that chatbot, but it doesn't load until a user engages with that chatbot. It needs to load on, like, just like the hero images that are or the carousel that are in the images. Like, the video doesn't turn on unless a user hovers over that hero image. That wouldn't take that long to go off into to build that type of interface to make sure that the user is looking at the content before they actually load the content.
So is that the sort of the lazy loading
Yeah.
principle? Yeah. Which I
Definitely.
know Drupal, there are some modules that sort of do that kind of thing.
And a lot of it's actually trying to be brought into core itself for lazy loading. There's a huge effort to try and support faster performance within Drupal and loading stuff that does not appear on the page as later on in the process. Yeah.
Interesting. So we're sort of moving into what I did was sort of split up thinking about it as like what you can do, and maybe the you here is like non-technical, like maybe you're not a developer or you don't have easy access to developer for a council, if you've got an external supplier and that budget is limited. And some of the things you both said is like optimizing images, like reviewing all of your content and that kind of thing. And we sort of also started talking a little bit about things that maybe local gov Drupal can do, or you can do by leveraging Drupal, which has got a lot of tools. So Mike, you mentioned the fences module for cleaning up your HTML, for example. I don't know, Mark, you're probably on, I think you're on the call. Yep. I don't know if that's in core or part of, like, how does that work for the base theme, for example?
It doesn't. We're using default field template for base theme, or default, we say, Drupal templates as our base theme bases.
You wouldn't want to use it unless you found ways that you can optimize the HTML that you're being. If there's bloat you want to cut out of out of Drupal, then you'd use it. If you've already optimized the output, then with custom twig files or whatnot, then you may not need it. But it's certainly one way to help with that process.
That's exactly the kind of approach we've taken, Mike, is that we have custom twig files for our accordion, for our box links and things like that. The feed maybe is one that we could look at optimizing a bit, but I kind of like Drupal's extra divs because we don't know what design a council is going to come up with. So the extra structure allows us to kind of be a bit more flexible.
The other thing is there a way to go off and like for accessibility, a lot of developers are incorporating Pally into the CI/CD structure so that every time there's a build, there's an evaluation of if there's any accessibility bugs that are added to the page. And the same thing could happen with something like CO2.js. As part of that process, as part of the build process, you evaluate the page weight. I don't know any system that's doing that yet, but there's no reason you couldn't evaluate that.
And the big one, which I know is in discussion, is around the image optimization. So doing a lot of that work and Drupal core, or local gov Drupal, sorry, having a lot of those image optimization modules sort of set up and configured already. And I think that's a work in progress as a sort of something that comes out of the box with LGV.
For me, that would be great, because I always feel bad sort of complaining about council homepages, because often they have to be updated by people who aren't in the IT department. They're in some other bit of the council and have very limited technical skills or lack of options available for someone to help them. So they're just dealing with what they've got to deal with, and often it's a CMS. So if you can build it into the CMS that it does a lot of the image optimization for people without them having to think, or gives them a helpful suggestion, like if they upload a massive image, just to say, would you like us to optimize it? And they can tick a box, and a suitable warning, so that if people really need to upload a massive image for some reason, they can. But otherwise, suggest to them, just press this button and it will be better, and do it for them.
Okay, so but it would still be an active opt-in of like, optimize this image for me, rather than a default.
I think there's probably some optimizations you can do, like strip out some of the metadata, so like all the camera settings and all of that type of stuff on photography. Stripping out that is probably fine, but if it's resizing an image, then maybe ask people, unless you can also make different size images for different purposes. So another thing that people tend to do when they make, say, news items on a homepage, is it's the same image that is the full scale image that gets squashed into a tiny box. So you might have a 200 pixel box, but it's got a 5,000 pixel by whatever 1,000 pixel image squashed into it. So if for different contexts, different size images, versions of it can be generated in the CMS, then that would be preferable. I don't want to have to force people in councils to have to think, who are updating homepages, have to think too much. If you can do that for them, please do.
You really have to try and address the defaults. So the defaults are a more sustainable default, just like with accessibility. If it's extra work, people are not going to do it. But I did want to highlight that the web sustainability guidelines are being mirrored within the sustainablewebdesign.org site. And there's also, we've pulled out the different roles that are involved in creating websites, and tried to go off and say, what are the success criteria for this that are aligned to a developer, to a front-end engineer, to a content person, and to try and make it as easy as possible for people to see what is relevant for them in their role. Because understanding a whole other set of guidelines is something that is outside of what most people are willing to do.
Brilliant. Okay, this is very interesting. I'm going to open up to the floor a little bit, and so we're talking about like what we can do to make it better, or what local gov Drupal can do, what there is in Drupal. If you want to put your hand up and bring something in that hasn't been mentioned, and you want to just share, we've got a few stickies that people have been adding on the board, and so feel free also to add some ideas there. Does anyone want to bring anything in? And we've got a couple of questions as well. We'll come to that.
Actually, one question that was raised earlier in the chat was about a good example for digital sustainability. I think, Will, you raised this. And I think that the UK government is a really excellent example, both in terms of their disclosure, their advice and guidance. I've posted one link for this, but there's quite a lot that's happening in the UK federal government. And so I think it's worthwhile looking at that and seeing what they're doing, and seeing if there's things that can be emulated, and also potentially there's a way to share back to the local councils as well.
Okay, brilliant. I've just added that to the useful links section.
As you zoomed into it, sort of, Aaron, the list I did there was for the people who are part of the council, that are part of local gov Drupal. I did a list. In your first 5 minutes, I noticed Carlow County Council and London Councils got mentioned, so I added them on the bottom because I didn't have them. So I did them as well. I think overall you're doing pretty well in local gov Drupal. Like Mike says, central government with the GDS and their design template, because I did an analysis of UK government organisations, which is a hard thing to define in the first place, what counts as a UK government organisation. I ended up with 500 and 60 or 80 of them, and I did their homepages. Ones that use the GDS template tended to perform really well. The template is really well designed and keeps things down, unless people add massive images of people to pages, or big news story images is when it breaks. But then other organizations that don't use that, I think Sport England were the worst, because they have loads of autoplaying videos and massive images on their page. So they were like a 50 megabyte homepage.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
But just you can see from the colours here that local Gov Drupal's doing pretty well in general.
Okay. That's good to hear. And obviously this is a homepage, so we're that's one page that you can really focus on. And then I guess the question is sort of taking some of these principles around images, video, use of JavaScript, and looking at those, you'll know those pages where you've got that sort of content and sort of, I really like your idea, Mike, about a page budget, like setting a page budget. What is a sensible page budget? Is that, do you have a...
We're definitely toying with what ideas to suggest within the web sustainability guidelines. There's good reason to go off and argue that a 200 kilobyte budget is something that you could be, that is a good thing to aspire to. It's not something that is that many will be able to achieve, and I think that's really is a huge stretch goal. But certainly just trying, again, can you make it 20% less this year than it was last? Can you try and push yourself to go off and identify where the bloat is and try and cut that so that your pages are loading faster and consuming less resources? Stuart, do you have a sense of what the average is on the sites you've scanned?
That's a great question. Put him on the spot, Mike. I like it.
It's a good way to defer from when I don't have a good answer. Is just sort of flip it around and. But it's, in some way, like the average is less important than what is the lowest instance. Like what is the best performing? Although even there you have to say, okay, if you've got a very simple website that doesn't have very much content, does that count? Because if you don't have a very much content, then really how much does it? You're not necessarily conveying rich content to your users. You're just conveying less content to their users. So to some extent, you need to evaluate the content that's on the page, not just the weight of the page itself.
Sorry, I have got an answer. I realized I was muted, so you weren't hearing me. The average for UK councils is 0.67 grams of CO2, and median is 0.45 grams. If I take that median, that is about 1.8 megabytes for a page, thereabouts.
Okay.
So that's where UK councils are doing. Website Carbon did say that the average was 0.5 grams. So councils are doing, on average, slightly better. If I take the median value against the average website, then they're doing slightly better. If I take the average value, then they're doing slightly worse. Okay. But to have your pages less than the average website, I think is a first goal. Mm-hmm. The 200 kilobytes would be fantastic, and I would wish everything was like that. But that, like Mike said, is going to be hard for a lot of people.
And what I heard, Mike, went from what you just said was you're talking about a small website with not much content. That brings up, there's a question often around, should this be a sub-site, as in part of a local Gov Drupal site, or a new site? Presumably, if you're spinning up a new site, that inherently has a carbon cost to it. And so bringing that into some of your decision-making would also be beneficial, right?
Yeah, and it might help people find the information more quickly. It may be something that's more memorable. There's all kinds of good reasons to do subsites, but it is also the cost of running the technology, but also like another huge cost of building this technology is the human labor to go off and to create it, because we're all producing CO2 as we're creating these websites. So if you're spinning up new websites all the time and not reusing and collaborating with open source tools, you're going to be using, like anytime you're building something from scratch, you're going to be using more CO2 as part of the process than if you could leverage something that's already there and build on that.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to stop sharing. So we're coming up to time. And I just wanted to check. Okay. Have you seen any public sector body? We've answered that. Doing this well. You were saying you're going to GDS. Have you needed to make
also Brighton's the 3rd best council in the UK, and Luton's the 9th best council. They're both in the local gov Drupal. Just to thumbs up to them.
On local gov Drupal, yeah, but well done, Luton. So hopefully you can carry that on. I think. So last question, and we'll go. If you need to drop off, go. Feel free. I understand that. Have you needed to make the case for sustainable web design to a client? What won them over? Are there any good resources you can share? And I guess this is something that if we think about in a council context, if you're making it up and saying, look, we need to make these changes and we need to sort of budget for this and account for this, like how would you go about making that business case? Is there something to point to, data around that?
I mean, so much of it comes down to ego. The UK government has in many ways defined, GDS has defined what a definition of what a good website means. That includes sustainability. It includes performance. That is part of the definition that is fairly globally respected. And comparing any website to the GDS, if you are slower, if you have a larger page weight, you're not following the example of the best out there. So that's what I try and use when I'm engaging with clients, is trying to say, how much behind the best do we want to be? Like, because we're not number one. We're definitely not number 100. The more competition you can bring, the more you can take the leaders and get them to say, we can be at least as good as the UK. That helps the US.
Okay, and not striving for perfection and being the enemy of good. So there's no excuse. Yeah. Okay.
I would say for non-governmental clients, then usually optimizing performance of your website is a good thing and tends to optimize your rankings in search engines as well. Yeah. For local councils, that's less of an issue because it's not like there's competition for your local council. You have one local council, so that's who you're going to go to, regardless of how bad their web page is. So it is a little bit harder. What I tried to do was then make the ranking of councils, because I felt a little bit of a carrot and stick type of approach that councils don't like to be doing worse than their neighbours generally. I know Leeds and Bradford have lots of rivalry, so sometimes I try to use that for good and get them to each improve, because as soon as Bradford does something better, Leeds can't be seen to be worse than Bradford, so Leeds improves. So I think in terms of councils, maybe there's a little bit of that, but that's what I'm trying to, as an outsider, trying to add a little bit of that in.
Thank you. That was lovely.
You can say to your chief executive, we're better than X.
Yeah, I like that. I like introducing the competition among councils to a collaborative council enterprise, Stuart. It's great. It's a good one. Thank you. We should wrap up because we're slightly over time. I love that, Stuart. Thank you so much for your time and insights into the carbon emissions and measuring it in councils and all that work you're doing. Like, it's amazing, and we shall keep reminding councils in our community about it and keep looking at it. And so your work certainly here won't be just into a black hole. So hopefully we'll keep the conversation going. And Mike, thank you so much for bringing all of that energy and ideas and like going out and that kind of thing. Just great to have you here again. We will keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm just gonna stop recording.